Hello, friends, and welcome to yet another episode. This time, I'm dealing with a question someone asked after watching one of our videos. And so, if you have questions and if you would like answers, I'm not saying that I have all the answers in the world, but we can definitely look at the Word, we can look at what Scripture has to tell us, and of course, we can seek the Lord if there is a question that really is on your mind and you really need an answer for that that is scripturally valid and logically sound. So this question came in from the US, and the question was that many times when we listen to other people speaking in tongues, the tongues sound like repeated syllables coming at intervals. It doesn't look like a language. It doesn't feel like a language. And scientifically speaking, that's the word he used, it feels like it doesn't match to the standards of being called a language. Now, let me tell you something. This is a question that a lot of people can have. Are the tongues that are being spoken today that don't seem like a language and the words being spoken feel like, repeated syllables and looks nothing like a sentence? Is this really the tongues that the New Testament talks about, or Paul and the apostles believed in? So is this even valid? And that's the question. Now, I want to bring to you two parts of Scripture. First of all, Paul talks about this in Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul is connecting something that is written in the Old Testament, which is what he's intending by the law. Now, this is not necessarily the Mosaic law, but he's talking about the Old Testament in general. And so, Paul is saying about the Old Testament, he's saying, God is saying, I will speak to these people with stammering lips and foreign tongues. And he connects that to tongues, and he's saying, therefore, tongues are assigned to unbelievers. Now, what exactly is this passage? Come with me to Isaiah chapter 28, verse 11. God says this exact phrase when Isaiah prophesies and says, with stammering lips and foreign tongues, I will speak to this people, and yet they will not listen. Now, I'm quoting from the Legacy Standard Bible. This is not just the King James. Those of you who know, Legacy is a fairly modern translation. He is talking, according to Paul, about tongues. And the nature of tongues that Paul is talking about, which Isaiah prophesied, is a stammering lip. Now, if Paul had not used this passage in connection to tongues, then probably, like most of the modern translators have done, we would have interpreted it as being a prophecy about, the Babylonian captivity or this or that and the other. For example, when Daniel prophesied about the abomination that makes desolate, if you look at the commentaries, most of the commentaries you're going to see, they are going to say this was Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greek invasion and all of that. While after the Greeks had left and the Romans were in power, Jesus mentions it and quotes Daniel and says it is going to happen. And it's very clear in Jesus' words that it's not something that has already happened, and it's not Antiochus Epiphanes. And yet our commentators would not let that rest. They will have to go with what they want to interpret it to be. And so this verse also, many translations, you're going to run into issues you'll feel when you read the passage in some of the translations. This can't be that. It doesn't say stammering in some of the translations, but because Paul uses that, I will go with that, because if you don't trust the interpretation of Paul, then a lot of scripture begins to hang in the balance for you. So Paul's interpretation of that is comparing that with tongues. And Paul, who spoke in tongues more than all the Corinthians at the church, he has no qualms comparing tongues to the stuttering lips of Isaiah. So in all probability, in Paul's time also, there was this stammering nature wherein syllables would be repeated, and that is totally fine. So just because someone doesn't speak something that's entirely like a sentence when you hear it, does not necessarily mean it is not tongues. Tongues does not necessarily mean that you are speaking an entire sentence in one language. It could be multiple languages being spoken in one sentence. It could be repeated syllables like Isaiah prophesied, and that Paul affirms that stammering lips is sometimes how tongues will feel like. And that's fine. In fact, I want to remind you, on the day of Pentecost also, while a lot of the people heard them speak the mighty works of God in their own languages, and they were amazed. Those people were amazed. Wow, how are we hearing the mighty works of God in our own languages? We're from 18 different places, 18 different languages, and we are hearing in our own language, which we speak back home as exiles or as foreigners in those cities. And they are amazed. But at the same time, there is another group of people who chose not to believe, and for them it sounded like these guys were drunk. Now, you may say that they were just ridiculing them and didn't really feel like that. Well, that's up for grabs. But I just want you to understand that there is this high possibility that even on the day of Pentecost, when they were speaking in tongues, some of them felt like words coming from a drunken stupor. Because otherwise, when people are all singing praises to God, there's no way anyone will say that they are drunk. Never once did people feel when Jesus was preaching or, when they were singing songs that, they were drunk. They gathered regularly in the temple even when Jesus was around, and no one ever said anything of the kind. But on the day of Pentecost, when they were speaking in tongues, it sounded to people that this was nonsensical and that they were, blabbering, and, it probably felt like gibberish, it probably felt like stammering. But for those who believed, they heard mighty things of God in their own language. Tongues of today are definitely the tongues of Acts chapter 2 and onward. And you don't have to worry why your tongue is only one word or it seems like one syllable. Don't stop there, because Isaiah said that. Paul connects it. You're okay as long as you keep pushing forward, as long as you keep praying. Don't just stop praying in tongues just because you have only 3 syllables or 5 syllables. Keep going, and God will fill you. He will give you new words. And as time changes, your tongue will change. As the Spirit is praying different things through you, different words will definitely come out. But right now, don't get obsessed, fixated, and stuck on that. Keep worshiping the Lord in spirit and truth, because that is what the Father seeks. God bless you. Thank you very much.